There's a question I keep coming back to when I look at Donald Trump, and it's not the one most people ask. It's not, is he good or bad? That's a debate that's been done to death, and it's not what we do here. The question I keep coming back to is, how does a man become like this? Because whatever side you're on politically, whatever you think of his policies, whatever he means to you personally, you cannot look at Donald Trump and tell me that is a normal human being. And I don't mean that as an insult, I mean that clinically. The patterns of behavior this man has shown consistently across decades, in business, in relationships, in politics, in the way he talks about himself, they don't just reflect ego or confidence or even arrogance. They point to something much deeper, something that was likely being built long before the cameras turned on him. Now, I want to be clear about what this video is and what it isn't. I'm not here to tell you Trump is evil. I'm not here to make you hate him or love him. My job, like it always is on this channel, is to explain the why. Why does he behave the way he does? Why does he respond to criticism the way he does? Why does he need the crowd, the applause, the loyalty, the dominance? Was he born this way, or was he made this way? And what does the psychology actually tell us? Was a childhood under one of New York's most ruthless real estate fathers the thing that broke something in him? Did decades of wealth and zero accountability turn a flawed man into something more? And what does the psychology of narcissism, Machiavellianism, and power-seeking actually look like when it reaches the highest office in the world?
Says,
You didn't think
keep your voice down, please. Keep your voice down.
Did you not?
I've been very consistent. I'm an extremely stable genius. Okay.
Are you still talking about Jeffrey Epstein? This guy's been talked about for years.
Had a brother, Fred, and he had a very, very, very tough life because of alcohol. Believe me, very, very tough life.
And we're doing very well in Iran, you see. And they said, well, how are you doing on a scale of 0 to 10? And I said, about a 15, I would say.
I will be the greatest jobs president that God ever created. I tell you that.
Let's get into it, because this is the dark psychology of Donald Trump. On June 14th, 1946, Donald John Trump was born in Queens, New York. He was the fourth of 5 children, Fred Jr., Mary Ann, Elizabeth, Donald, and then Robert, born to Fred Trump Sr. and Mary Ann McLeod Trump. Now, this is typically the part of my videos where I tell you about some difficult childhood, poverty, abuse, neglect, instability, and in the traditional sense, Trump didn't have any of that. The family was wealthy. Fred Trump Sr. was a property developer who'd built a real estate empire across Brooklyn and Queens. There was money, there was structure, there was a mother and a father in the home. But here's the thing, and this is something Mary Trump, Donald's own niece who is a trained clinical psychologist, goes deep on in her book. The absence of physical poverty doesn't mean the absence of emotional poverty. And in the Trump household, the emotional environment was, by most accounts, pretty cold. Fred Trump Sr. was what you'd call a classic self-made man of his era. Hard, transactional, emotionally unavailable. He didn't really believe in unconditional love. He believed in performance. You produced results, you got approval. You showed weakness, you got nothing. Or worse, you got dismissed. There's a concept in psychology called conditional positive regard, first described by Carl Rogers, and it basically means love or approval that only comes when certain conditions are met. When a child grows up in an environment where they feel they have to earn love, earn praise, earn attention, it does something to their developing sense of self. It creates this deep, almost desperate need for external validation, because internally, they never quite feel like enough. In Mary Trump's assessment, and she knew this family from the inside, Donald was essentially raised to believe that vulnerability was weakness, that losing was shameful, and that being a killer, Fred Sr.'s actual word, was the highest compliment a person could receive. She paints a picture of a childhood defined by emotional deprivation and conditional love. And when I look at that through a clinical lens, the framework that fits best is CPTSD, not from a single traumatic event, but from a prolonged childhood environment of emotional deprivation and conditional love. CPTSD in adults can look like chronic feelings of emptiness or worthlessness, extreme sensitivity to criticism, difficulty regulating emotions, a desperate need for control, and the development of a false self, a persona constructed to hide the real, vulnerable one underneath. If you look at that list and think about how Donald Trump publicly behaves, I'll let you draw your own conclusions for now. There's also the matter of Fred Trump Jr., Donald's older brother. Freddie, as the family called him, was everything Fred Sr. didn't want. He was sensitive, funny, warm. He wanted to be a pilot, not a property developer. Fred Sr. reportedly mocked him for it, called him a bus driver in the sky. Freddie struggled badly, turned to alcohol, and died at 43. Donald has spoken about watching what happened to his brother and deciding early on that he would never let himself be seen as soft, that he would never be Freddie.
I had a brother, Fred, great guy, best personality, much better than mine, but he had a problem. He had a problem with alcohol, and he had a very, very, very tough life because of alcohol, believe me, very, very tough life. But I learned because of Fred, I learned.
So what you have is a child who is raised by a cold, achievement-obsessed father, watching his sensitive older brother get destroyed for showing emotion, being told in every possible way that strength, dominance, and winning are the only things that matter, and then being sent off to military school at 13, which, by the way, Fred Sr. did partly because Donald was already showing behavioral issues, getting into fights and being disruptive. New York Military Academy. Trump has spoken about it positively in interviews. He says it made him competitive, disciplined, tough, and maybe it did, but send a kid with an already developing attachment issues to a place built on hierarchy, dominance, and performance, and you're not fixing the problem, you're just giving it a uniform. When he came back from military school and went to Fordham, then Wharton, the transformation was pretty much complete. Donald Trump the persona, confident, aggressive, never wrong, never weak, was locked in. The question is whether any version of the real Donald ever survived underneath it. After graduating from Wharton in 1968, Trump joined his father's real estate company, then called Elizabeth Trump & Son. And here's where the story gets interesting from a psychological perspective, because what Donald does next isn't just build a career, it's build a character. Fred Sr.'s business was solid but unglamorous. Affordable housing in Brooklyn and Queens. Donald wanted Manhattan. He wanted towers with his name on them. He wanted the kind of recognition that his father, for all his success, never got. And that distinction matters, because it tells you that this was never really about money. The money was always just a scoreboard.
$246,000 maintaining his private plane, $840,000 on his Princess yacht, $2 million in interest on his personal line of credit, and $380,000 for charity and legal fees.
He made his first real move in the mid-1970s with the Commodore Hotel deal in Midtown Manhattan. The place was basically falling apart. Most developers didn't want to touch it. Trump didn't even have the kind of money you would normally need for a project like that. But he leaned on his father's connections, partnered with Hyatt, and somehow convinced New York City to give him a massive tax break to make the numbers work. The whole thing was a huge gamble, but it paid off. The hotel was rebuilt as the Grand Hyatt, and just like that, Donald Trump went from being a rich developer's son in Queens to a name people in Manhattan actually started paying attention to. What's interesting here from a psychology standpoint is what success did to him, because it reinforced everything. Every time he took a massive swing and landed, it told his brain, this works. The bravado works. The exaggeration works. The refusal to accept the possibility of failure works. This is where I want to introduce you to the concept of narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD, because I think it's impossible to analyze Trump without it. NPD is a personality disorder characterized by an inflated sense of self-importance, an excessive need for admiration, a lack of empathy for others, and a pattern of exploiting relationships for personal gain. Now, I want to be careful here, because NPD is a real clinical condition, and you can't formally diagnose someone without assessing them directly. What I can tell you is that over 30 mental health professionals signed an open letter in 2017 warning about what they described as Trump displaying dangerous levels of narcissistic behavior. Dr. John Gartner, a former Johns Hopkins psychologist, went further. He argued Trump meets the criteria for malignant narcissism, which is the more severe and dangerous form.
He has the most severe personality disorder, actually, that a human being can have. It's called malignant narcissism. It was originally introduced by Erich Fromm, who escaped the Nazis, to explain the psychology of Hitler and other murderous dictators like him.
Mary Trump herself, again, trained psychologist, family member, has used NPD as her framework for understanding him. So let's look at the traits and see how they map. Grandiosity? Check. This man has referred to himself as a genius, as the greatest president in American history, as someone who knows more about military strategy than the generals, more about tax law than any accountant. These aren't just moments of arrogance. They're consistent, decades-long patterns. Need for admiration? Check. The rally crowds, the constant polling, the obsession with ratings, the fact that even in press conferences about national emergencies, the conversation would somehow end up about how well he was doing. For a narcissist, the supply of admiration isn't just a nice thing to have, it's oxygen. Lack of empathy. Now this one's more complex with Trump because he can perform warmth when he needs to, but there are consistent accounts of him being unable to sit with other people's pain without making it about himself. His response to tragedies, his treatment of staff who failed him, the way he talks about people the moment they become useless to him, it makes it a hard one to judge. Exploitation of relationships. We'll get onto this more as we go, but Trump's entire business model, and his later political model, has been built on using people for what they can give him and discarding them when they can't. The list of people he's called great and then terrible the moment they crossed him is longer than I have time for in this video. Throughout the 80s, the brand just exploded. Trump Tower, Trump Plaza, the casinos, the book, The Art of the Deal, which, let's be real, was mostly written by Tony Schwartz, who has since said publicly he regrets it and that Trump barely participated in the writing process. But it didn't matter. The book cemented the mythology. Donald Trump, self-made genius, master deal maker. Except, and this is important, he wasn't really self-made, and the deals weren't always that great. A New York Times investigation found that Trump received at least $413 million in today's money from his father's real estate empire, much of it through tax avoidance schemes. His casinos went bankrupt, multiple businesses failed, but here's the Machiavellian genius of what he built. The brand survived all of it, because he understood something that most business people don't. Perception is more powerful than reality. Machiavellianism is a personality trait characterized by strategic manipulation, a cynical worldview, and a willingness to deceive and exploit others to achieve goals. Named after Niccolo Machiavelli, the end always justifies the means. Machiavellian thinkers don't see honesty as virtue. They see it as a variable, something you deploy when it's useful and discard it when it isn't. Trump's relationship with the truth has been documented exhaustively. The Washington Post counted over 30,000 false or misleading statements during his presidency alone. But the point isn't that he lies. Plenty of people lie. The point is the pattern, the deliberate, strategic construction of an alternative reality designed to serve his image. That's Machiavellianism in action. By the time The Apprentice launched in 2004, Trump had gone through multiple business failures, a very public divorce from Ivana, and was carrying somewhere around $900 million in debt at one point. He was, by traditional metrics, on the ropes, and then he turned on a TV camera and told 20 million people a week that he was the most successful businessman in America. The Apprentice is one of the greatest rebranding exercises in modern media history. And if you understand narcissism, it makes complete sense. Because for a narcissist, the story is not a reflection of reality. The story is the reality. Trump didn't need to actually be the world's greatest businessman. He needed to be seen as one. And for 14 seasons, he was. Narcissistic supply is the attention, admiration, and validation that a narcissist depends on to maintain their self-image. It can come from praise, fear, fame, or even conflict, as long as the narcissist remains the center. The show gave him something that pure business success never could, a direct weekly feed of narcissistic supply into tens of millions of homes. He was the ultimate authority. He made the calls. He said, "You're fired," and people trembled. It was a performance of exactly the kind of dominance that Fred Sr. had told him to aspire to since he was a kid. And what's fascinating is how deliberately he constructed it. Mark Burnett, the producer, has described how extensively Trump was involved in crafting his own image on screen. The boardroom scenes were often reshot. The framing of his entrances, his desk, his decisions, all of it was engineered. This wasn't a man who happened to be on TV. This was a man who understood the camera as a tool for building the persona he needed the world to see. During this same period, Trump was also becoming a master of another media tool, tabloids, specifically the New York tabloids. There's documented evidence that Trump would call gossip columns pretending to be his own publicist, under names like John Barron or John Miller, to plant stories about how successful he was, how many women wanted him, how much money he had. He denied it for years, but there's a recording.
And he's starting to do tremendously well financially. And he just thought it was too soon to make any commitment to anybody. He's somebody that has a lot of options, and frankly, he gets called by everybody. He gets called by everybody in the book in terms of women.
Now think about that for a second. This isn't just spin or PR. This is a man calling up journalists, pretending to be someone else, and tell them how great Donald Trump is. That's not a confidence move. That's compulsive. That's someone whose need for external validation is so consuming that they'll manufacture it themselves rather than go without. He also had a long and strategic relationship with the National Enquirer, specifically with its publisher, David Pecker, where stories that could damage Trump were bought and killed, a practice that became known as catch and kill.
Basically, the overall plan was to catch any information which would have negatively impacted the Trump campaign and to kill that story or kill that information.
This was Machiavellianism at its most organized, not just manipulating the narrative, but paying to make sure damaging truths never reached the public at all. He didn't need to win the news cycle, he had become the news cycle. When Trump came down the escalator in June 2015 and announced he was running for president, most people laughed. Political establishment, the media, even people within the Republican Party thought it was a publicity stunt. And maybe it started as one, but something happened along the way. The crowd responded, and for a man built on narcissistic supply, there is no drug stronger than 20,000 screaming people chanting your name. The rallies became the thing, not the policy, not the governance, the rallies. Because the rally was pure, unfiltered supply, adoration on demand, a room full of people who had chosen to be there specifically for him, who would cheer everything he said, who would laugh at every joke, who would boo the people who told them to boo. And I think this is crucial to understanding his presidency, because when you understand that the primary goal was always the supply rather than the governance, a lot of things that seemed confusing start to make sense. The obsession with crowd sizes, the need to hold rallies during actual crises, the fact that his approval rating was something he monitored more than briefing reports. The governance was secondary to being seen as a great governor. The thing about putting a narcissist in the most powerful position on earth is that it doesn't satisfy them. It raises the stakes of every perceived slight. Because now, when someone criticizes you, they're not just criticizing a businessman or a TV host, they're criticizing the President of the United States. And for someone whose entire psychological architecture is built around never being seen as weak or wrong, that is almost unbearable. Look at how he responds to criticism versus how most leaders respond to criticism. Most leaders either engage substantively or deflect and move on. Trump retaliates, personally, relentlessly.
You are the worst reporter. No wonder CNN has no ratings because of people like you. You know, she's a young woman. I don't think I've ever seen you smile. I've known you for 10 years. I don't think I've ever seen a smile on your face. You know why? You know why you're not smiling? Because you know you're not telling the truth. And they should be ashamed of you.
Journalists, judges, generals, allies, anyone who publicly questioned him got the same treatment. A nickname, a Twitter attack, an attempt to destroy their reputation. This isn't strategy. This is narcissistic injury playing out in real time at a global scale. James Mattis, his own Secretary of Defense, a 4-star general, resigned and said Trump lacked the character to lead. John Kelly, his chief of staff, reportedly called him an idiot and said he was the most flawed person he'd ever met. Rex Tillerson, his Secretary of State, allegedly called him a moron. These aren't political opponents. These are the people he chose to be closest to him, who then watched him up close and concluded the same thing. And then there's the paranoia. This is the fourth pillar of what Mary Trump and others identify as his psychological profile, a deep structural suspicion of others, a belief that people are always out to get him, always plotting, always disloyal. In his world, there are two categories of people, those who serve him completely and enemies. There's no neutral. You're either with him or you're against him, and the moment you become the latter, the war starts. He went through 4 national security advisors, 4 chiefs of staff, 2 secretaries of state, 2 defense secretaries. Either he is the most unlucky employer in history, or the environment he creates is so unstable and so personality driven that normal people cannot function within it. When he says something untrue, the interesting thing isn't the lie itself. The interesting thing is the pattern. The lies tend to cluster around his self-image, around crowd sizes, election margins, business success, physical appearance, personal achievements. The untruths aren't random. They're protecting something. In psychology, this is sometimes described as confabulation, where the brain unconsciously fills in gaps or revises memories to match what the person needs to believe about themselves. It's not always cynical lying. Sometimes it's a man that genuinely cannot tolerate a version of reality where they lost or failed or weren't the best. Whether that is what's happening with Trump, or whether it's pure strategic deception, I'll leave that one to you. Alright, I know this is the chapter a lot of you have been waiting for, and I'm going to cover it the way I cover everything on this channel. Facts where they're confirmed, clearly flagged where they're alleged or unproven. I'm not here to push a conspiracy. I'm here to give you the documented picture. Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein knew each other. That's not disputed. They moved in the same social circles in New York and Palm Beach through the late 1980s and 1990s. Both were wealthy, status-obsessed, and socially ambitious in the same worlds. Real estate, celebrity, New York nightlife. They attended some of the same parties. Epstein was a member at Mar-a-Lago for a period, though he was later banned. More on that in a moment. In 2002, Trump gave an interview to New York Magazine and said, and this is a direct quote, that Epstein was a terrific guy and that he was a lot of fun to be with. He added that Epstein liked beautiful women as much as I do, and many of them are on the younger side. Now, that last part, whether Trump meant that casually, whether he knew the full extent of what younger side meant in Epstein's world, or whether it was a genuine insight into shared appetites, I can't tell you. What I can tell you is that it's a quote that exists, is documented, and is one of the reasons this connection gets discussed. There's also a video from a 1992 party at Mar-a-Lago in which both Trump and Epstein are visible, laughing and interacting with cheerleaders. This footage exists. Again, a party in 1992 doesn't prove anything beyond the fact that they were in the same room. There's actually interesting documents that defend Trump's involvement with Epstein involving Mar-a-Lago. According to Brad Edwards, a lawyer who represented several of Epstein's victims, Trump was the only beach club owner who agreed to speak with investigators during the early Epstein investigation. Edwards later said Trump provided information that was helpful to the case.
That I talked to President Trump back in 2009, and several times after that, he didn't think that it was a hoax then. In fact, he helped me. He got on the phone. He told me things that were helping our investigation. Now, our investigation wasn't looking into him, but he was helping us then.
It wouldn't be smart to snitch on someone who you was doing inappropriate things with, would it? Years later, when Epstein was arrested again in 2019, Trump publicly distanced himself from him entirely. He said the two had fallen out years earlier and that Epstein had been banned from Mar-a-Lago. Trump's name does appear in some of the documentation connected to the Epstein investigations, mostly in the context of social connections and the broader circle Epstein operated in. But as of the time I'm making this video, there's no released evidence showing Trump participating in Epstein's criminal activities firmly, and he's never been charged in relation to the case. There's no evidence that makes me go, oh yeah, we got him, there he is. But if that ever changes, I will cover it. But the things in there that aren't proven, I'm not going to present as fact. What I will say, and this is my own observation rather than a confirmed fact, is that Trump and Epstein moved in many of the same wealthy social circles in New York and Palm Beach, the same elite environment where Epstein was able to operate for years without serious consequences. Whether Trump was an active participant, someone who was just in that social circle, or someone who genuinely walked away when he got uncomfortable, I don't know. Nobody outside of that circle knows. What I do know is this: the psychological profile we've been building throughout this video, the grandiosity, the entitlement, the transactional view of other people, these are traits that made men like Epstein's guest possible. I'm not necessarily saying criminal, but the kind of man who wouldn't necessarily ask the questions he should have been asking. And with the evidence I've laid before you, it's up to you to make your own opinion on the connection between Jeffrey Epstein and Donald Trump. So let's bring this home, because I've taken you through the childhood, the rise, the brand, the presidency, the Epstein connection, and now I want to do what we always do at the end of these videos: pull out the psychological thread and show you what it actually looks like when you put it all together. Donald Trump, in my view, is the product of three things colliding: a childhood environment that taught him love was conditional and weakness was fatal, a personality that was probably already predisposed towards narcissistic traits, and then decades of an external world that rewarded every single one of those traits: the aggression, the grandiosity, the refusal to be wrong, with money, fame, and eventually political power. That combination, I'd argue, is more dangerous than any one of those things in isolation, because if you have just a predisposition without the environment reinforcing it, it might stay manageable. If you have the environment but not the predisposition, it might still produce a difficult person but not a fully developed pattern. But when all three come together, predisposition, conditioning, and reinforcement, you get something that is very hard to reach and almost impossible to change. In terms of specific conditions, the frameworks that keep coming up from credentialed professionals who have studied him are narcissistic personality disorder, potentially in its malignant form, possible CPTSD from prolonged childhood emotional deprivation, and strong Machiavellian traits. Whether those are separate personality dimension or a consequence of the MPD, I'll leave that to the actual psychologists. What I think is harder to argue with is the dark triad, the combination of narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy adjacent traits. Now, psychopathy is a strong word, and I'm not saying Trump is a psychopath in the clinical sense, but in the component that overlaps, the reduced empathy, the willingness to use people as tools, the absence of genuine guilt when others get hurt by his decisions, those are present in the documented record. There are people who genuinely love Donald Trump, and I think it's worth asking, through this psychological lens, why? Because for a lot of his supporters, what they see in him is someone who refuses to be diminished, someone who fights back when they feel like they, and people like them, have been ignored or looked down on. And on that level, regardless of whether the psychology underneath is healthy or not, the thing he projects, the unbreakable confidence, the refusal to apologize, or the "I'm not scared of you" energy, it resonates. Is that genuine? Or is it a man who learned at age 7 from his father that showing weakness means losing everything, and has never stopped performing strength to cover it up? I genuinely don't know. And I think that uncertainty is actually the most honest place to land. Because unlike some of the other people I've covered on this channel, where the psychology was relatively clear and the verdict was pretty ambiguous, Donald Trump is a more complicated case. He's not a predator in the Epstein mold. He's not a criminal in the way some of the others I've covered are. He's something more nuanced, and arguably more interesting to analyze. A man whose psychological wounds became the engine of one of the most consequential political careers in modern history. Whether that story ends with him as a tragic failure, a villain, a hero, or simply a very loud, very damaged human being who happened to be in the right place at the right time, that's for history to decide, and probably for the comment section. What I hope you take from this video isn't a conclusion about whether Trump is good or bad. I hope you take a framework, because the psychology we've talked about today, conditional love, narcissistic development, the Machiavellian use of power, the way environments either contain or amplify certain traits, it doesn't just apply to Donald Trump. It applies to people in your own life, it applies to systems, it applies to why certain types of personalities keep ending up in certain positions of power, across history, across cultures, over and over again. Understanding the why doesn't excuse the what, but it makes you better equipped to see it coming next time. If you'd like to support my channel and get things like uncensored content, my unfiltered opinion on certain topics, as well as your name in the credits, please support the channel via Patreon. I've been Jay Wisdom, and until next time.
My life been looking gorgeous. Take one day at a time, I pray I never have to force it. Got bad women for me, tell they man he need to forfeit. I'm standing with the torch gripped in my hand, I'm hella calm, the other palm hold my fortune. I live ready to die, my mama hate me sounding morbid. Growing up, my daddy got caught up in chasing fortune. He'd probably be more proud if I